"You should be ashamed of yourself, Claire," my mother said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the ballroom so clearly that every conversation stopped at once. More than 100 faces turned toward me. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Glasses hovered above white tablecloths. Even the soft music seemed to fade into the background. I remained seated, my hands wrapped around a glass of ice water, while my parents stood at the front of the room, wearing expressions of disappointment carefully crafted for an audience. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became the night they tried to destroy me. My name is Claire Bennett, and until that evening, I still believed there were some lines parents would never cross. The event was being held at a country club outside Columbus, Ohio. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across polished hardwood floors. Friends, relatives, business associates, and neighbors filled the room. From a distance, it looked like the picture of a perfect American family gathering. That illusion lasted right up until my father picked up the microphone. "We've always sacrificed everything for our daughter," William Bennett announced with a heavy sigh. "But sometimes children grow up and forget where they came from." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others nodded politely, assuming they were hearing a harmless family story. I knew better. My mother stepped forward next. Patricia Bennett had spent her entire life perfecting the image of a devoted parent. Her smile looked gentle. Her voice sounded emotional. That made her words even more effective. "We never wanted to discuss private matters publicly," she said. "But after everything we've done for Claire, we simply can't stay silent anymore." I felt dozens of eyes settle on me. The room suddenly seemed smaller, warmer. The ice in my glass cracked softly. "Some people only think about themselves," my father continued. "They forget family. They forget loyalty." The audience still didn't know exactly what they were accusing me of, but that hardly mattered. The implication was enough. People began filling in the blanks themselves. That's how public humiliation works. It doesn't need details. It only needs a target. Across the room, I noticed my friend Rachel Collins staring at me with concern. She knew something the others didn't. She knew the truth was far more complicated than the story being told on that stage. My parents continued for nearly 10 minutes. Every sentence was carefully designed, every pause rehearsed. They painted themselves as generous victims and me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned the family that raised her. A few guests looked sympathetic toward them. Some looked disappointed in me. Others simply looked relieved that the drama wasn't happening to their family. Through it all, I never interrupted. I never raised my voice. I never defended myself. I simply listened, because arguing would have given them exactly what they wanted. My mother finally looked directly at me. "Do you have anything you'd like to say for yourself, Claire?" The room fell silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I could hear silverware being set down. I could hear my own heartbeat. Slowly I stood. Every eye followed me. My parents watched with quiet confidence. They thought they had already won. They thought the audience belonged to them. I offered a small smile. Not angry, not bitter, just calm. "No," I said softly. "Not tonight." My father's shoulders relaxed. My mother smiled as if my silence proved her point. Around the room, conversations cautiously resumed. The tension began to fade. People returned to their meals. The show appeared to be over. But as I sat back down, my fingers brushed against the manila envelope resting inside my handbag beneath the table. The envelope that contained documents, records, and evidence I had spent months gathering. The envelope that could explain everything. My parents believed they had exposed me in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that I already had proof of the secret they had spent years hiding. 3 months earlier, if someone had asked me whether I trusted my parents, I would have answered without hesitation. Yes, not because they were perfect, but because they were my parents. I had spent nearly 30 years believing that whatever flaws existed in our family, there was still a foundation of honesty underneath it all. Looking back now, I realize trust can survive long after the evidence supporting it has disappeared. The first signs were so small that I almost ignored them. A delayed phone call, a conversation that stopped when I entered the room, a strange look passing between my mother and father during family dinners. None of it seemed important on its own. Life was busy. I worked long hours as a project coordinator for a manufacturing company outside Columbus, and most evenings I was too exhausted to analyze every awkward moment. My parents lived less than 20 minutes away, and I still visited regularly. From the outside, we looked close. We attended birthdays together. shared holiday meals, took family photographs that eventually appeared on social media accompanied by captions about gratitude and family values. Those pictures always received dozens of comments. People admired what they thought they saw. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house to help my mother organize old boxes in the basement. The air smelled faintly of dust and cardboard. Sunlight filtered through the small basement windows, casting pale rectangles across the concrete floor. We spent hours sorting through photo albums, tax records, and stacks of forgotten paperwork. At one point, my mother received a phone call and hurried upstairs. I remained behind, placing folders into storage bins. That was when I noticed a document sticking halfway out of a manila envelope. It was only visible for a second before I pushed it back where it belonged. I did not read it. I did not examine it. But I remember one detail clearly. My name appeared at the top of the page. At the time, I assumed it was something harmless. Maybe an old insurance form or family record. Still, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not fear, not suspicion, just discomfort. The kind that lingers after a dream you cannot fully remember. A week later, my father called asking for another favor. He often needed help with paperwork because he disliked dealing with online accounts. Nothing unusual there. I drove over after work and spent nearly an hour updating information on several financial websites while he watched television in the next room. What struck me was how nervous he seemed. He kept asking whether I could see certain account details, whether specific documents were visible, whether I had opened the wrong page by mistake. It felt odd. My father had always been confident, even stubborn. That evening he seemed distracted, almost anxious. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation in my mind. The questions, the tension in his voice, the way my mother avoided eye contact when I left. For the first time, a thought entered my mind that I immediately pushed away. What if they were hiding something? The idea felt ridiculous. I dismissed it before I even reached my apartment. Yet over the following weeks, similar moments continued to pile up. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they began forming a pattern. And patterns have a way of revealing truths long before we are ready to see them. The strange feeling should have disappeared. Instead, it grew stronger with every passing week. What bothered me most was not any single event. It was the accumulation of small things that no longer seemed accidental. My parents had always been involved in my life, sometimes more than I preferred, but recently their behavior had shifted in ways I could not ignore. They asked unusual questions about my finances. They wanted to know whether I had checked my credit report recently. They wondered if I still used the same bank. My father even asked whether I kept digital copies of important documents. At first I laughed it off. I assumed they were becoming more cautious as they got older. But each conversation left me with the same uneasy feeling. One evening, I met Rachel Collins for dinner at a small restaurant downtown. We had been friends since college. Rachel possessed the rare ability to notice things other people missed. We ordered burgers and iced tea, and after a few minutes she set down her glass and looked directly at me. "Something is bothering you," she said. I tried to dismiss it. Then I found myself telling her everything. The strange questions, the nervous behavior, the document I had glimpsed in the basement. Rachel listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and thought for a moment. "Have you checked your credit lately?" she asked. I laughed. Why would I do that? Her expression did not change. Because if something feels wrong, you verify it. The suggestion seemed unnecessary. I had never missed a payment. My finances were stable. My credit score had always been excellent. Still, Rachel's words lingered in my mind. The next Saturday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I logged into one of the major credit monitoring services, expecting to find nothing unusual. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was an active loan listed under my name that I did not recognize. I stared at the screen for several seconds, convinced there had to be a mistake. The balance exceeded $40,000. The account had been open for more than a year. I clicked through the details repeatedly, hoping I had misunderstood what I was seeing. But the information remained the same. My hands felt cold. I checked the account number again, then the address associated with the loan, the lender, the payment history. Everything appeared legitimate. Everything except one detail. I had never applied for it. I sat motionless at the table. The coffee beside me had gone cold. Questions raced through my mind. Had someone stolen my identity? Was it a clerical error? Could the lender have confused me with someone else? I wanted a simple explanation. Something boring. Something ordinary. But another memory surfaced immediately. My father's nervous questions. My mother's sudden phone call in the basement. The document with my name at the top. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had spent weeks avoiding. What if this was connected to them? The thought felt almost disloyal. Parents were supposed to protect their children, not create problems for them. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the rain continued falling across the parking lot. Cars moved through puddles. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Yet something fundamental had changed. The family story I had believed for nearly 3 decades was beginning to crack. And once a crack appears, it becomes impossible to stop looking at it. For 2 days, I told myself there had to be another explanation. I contacted the lender directly and spent nearly an hour navigating automated menus before finally speaking with a representative. I expected confusion. I expected an obvious mistake that would be corrected within minutes. Instead, the woman on the phone calmly verified the account information and informed me that every document associated with the loan appeared complete. Applications, supporting records, signatures, payment history, everything matched the information they had on file. When I asked for copies of the original paperwork, she explained the process for obtaining them. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence at my kitchen table. The room felt strangely still. The clock above the stove ticked loudly. Outside, sunlight reflected off parked cars in the lot below. Ordinary sounds, ordinary sights, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. 3 days later, a large envelope arrived in my mailbox. I carried it upstairs without opening it. My hands trembled slightly as I placed it on the kitchen counter. Part of me did not want to know what was inside. As long as the envelope remained sealed, there was still room for uncertainty. Possibility. Denial. Once opened, there would only be facts. I finally slid a letter opener beneath the flap and removed the documents. The first pages contained account summaries and payment records. Then I reached the application itself. My name appeared across the top. My address. My personal information. Every detail looked accurate. Too accurate. Then I saw the signature. I stared at it for several seconds. At first glance it resembled mine. Someone unfamiliar with my handwriting would never question it. But I recognized subtle differences immediately. The shape of certain letters. The spacing between words. Small imperfections that revealed imitation rather than authenticity. Someone had tried very hard to copy my signature. Someone who knew me well. I continued turning pages. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Additional forms contained the same imitation signature. Supporting documents referenced information that should have been private. Information available only to a handful of people. A cold realization settled over me. This was not random identity theft. This was personal. I called Rachel that evening and asked whether she could come over. An hour later, she sat across from me at the kitchen table reviewing the paperwork. Neither of us spoke much at first. The documents seemed to speak for themselves. Finally, she looked up. Who had access to all of this information? She asked quietly. I already knew the answer. My parents. The words felt impossible even inside my own mind. Rachel did not rush to conclusions. That was one reason I trusted her. She simply pointed to facts. The address history. The financial records. The personal details. Each piece narrowed the circle further. By the time she left that night, my apartment felt different. Smaller somehow. I walked from room to room, unable to settle my thoughts. Memories surfaced one after another. Times my father insisted on keeping copies of family documents. Times my mother offered to help organize paperwork. Conversations I had forgotten years ago suddenly returned with uncomfortable clarity. None of those memories proved anything. Not yet, but they formed a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. Before going to bed, I placed the loan documents back into the envelope and locked them inside a desk drawer. Then I stood beside the window overlooking the dark parking lot. Somewhere beyond the city lights, my parents were probably ending their evening exactly as they always had. They had no idea I was beginning to see the picture hidden beneath the story they had spent years presenting to the world. The following weeks became an exercise in patience. Every instinct told me to confront my parents immediately, to place the documents on the table and demand an explanation. But something held me back. If the evidence pointed where I feared it did, then one uncomfortable conversation would. not reveal the full truth. I needed facts, not assumptions. So I stayed quiet. I answered phone calls as usual. I attended Sunday dinners. I smiled when expected. And all the while, I paid attention. It was remarkable how much people revealed when they believed they were not being watched. Rachel helped me organize everything. One evening, she arrived carrying a legal pad and a folder filled with notes. We spread documents across my dining table and began building a timeline. Loan records, account statements, dates, addresses, signatures. Individually, each piece raised questions. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The loan had not appeared suddenly. It was part of a larger sequence stretching back several years. That discovery unsettled me more than anything else. If someone had used my information once, it might have been desperation. If it happened repeatedly, it suggested planning. We began requesting additional records wherever possible. The process was slow. Some institutions required formal requests. Others provided limited information. Yet with every response, another piece of the puzzle appeared. One afternoon, I received a copy of an older financial document connected to an account I did not recognize. Again, my name appeared. Again, the signature looked almost like mine. Almost. I stared at the page for several minutes before placing it beside the others. Rachel did not need to say anything. We both saw the same thing. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, my parents continued behaving as though nothing had changed. My mother invited me to lunch one Saturday. She chatted about neighbors, recipes, and local events. My father called to ask whether I planned to attend an upcoming family gathering. Listening to them felt surreal. Every ordinary conversation now carried a second layer beneath it. I found myself studying pauses, expressions, small reactions, looking for signs that they knew I was getting closer to something. If they suspected anything, they hid it well. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier, shortly after I started my first full-time job, my father had insisted on helping me organize important paperwork. At the time, I appreciated the gesture. He created folders, labeled documents, and offered practical advice about financial responsibility. Back then, it felt like support. Now I remembered how many personal records had passed through his hands. Tax forms, employment information, banking details. The realization sat heavily in my chest. Not because it proved anything new, but because it transformed an old memory into something far less comforting. One night, while reviewing records for what felt like the 100th time, Rachel pointed to a sequence of dates highlighted on the timeline. Several questionable transactions occurred during periods when my parents faced financial pressure. Medical expenses, home repairs, other costs that would have strained their budget. The timing caught my attention immediately. For the first time, a possible motive emerged. Not certainty, not proof, but motive. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the table at the growing stack of documents. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of a lamp. Months earlier, I believed I was searching for an explanation. Now I understood something different. The explanation was already taking shape. What remained hidden was the full extent of it. And with every document we uncovered, the answer appeared larger than I had ever imagined. The breakthrough arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when I was not expecting it. I had taken an early lunch break and was sitting in my car outside my office, reviewing emails on my phone, when a notification appeared from one of the institutions we had contacted weeks earlier. Another records request had been completed. I almost ignored it. By that point, I had reviewed so many documents that every new file felt like another piece of an endless puzzle. Still, I opened the attachment. Within seconds, my pulse quickened. The document referenced an account I had never authorized, but that was not the shocking part. Attached to the file was a correspondence history. Several messages had been exchanged over a period of years. Most were routine. Then I saw an email address connected to administrative updates on the account. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my father. I stared at the screen, reading the address again and again as if repetition might somehow change it. It did not. For several minutes, I remained motionless in the driver's seat. Cars entered and exited the parking lot around me. Employees walked toward nearby restaurants. The world continued normally while my understanding of my family shifted beneath my feet. Until that moment, I had been following evidence. Now the evidence was pointing directly at someone I loved. That evening, Rachel came over after work. We spread the newest documents across the dining table beneath the warm light of a floor lamp. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional sound of traffic outside. She reviewed the email records carefully before setting them aside. Neither of us rushed to speak. Finally, she looked at me and said what I had been avoiding for weeks. "Claire, this is no longer a coincidence." Hearing the words aloud felt different. Harder, more permanent. I looked down at the stack of papers. The signatures, the account histories, the timelines, the correspondence. Every path seemed to lead to the same place. Yet another question remained unanswered. Why? The answer began emerging over the next several days. More records arrived. Some contained financial details tied to expenses that matched difficult periods in my parents' lives. Others revealed patterns of borrowing, refinancing, and shifting balances between accounts. Individually, none of it looked dramatic. Together, it painted a picture of people struggling to maintain an image they desperately wanted the world to believe. My parents had always cared about appearances. Their home was immaculate. Their social circle admired them. At church events and neighborhood gatherings, they were viewed as responsible, dependable people. I had admired that image myself for years. Now I began to see how much effort had gone into preserving it. The deeper I looked, the more I realized that some of their financial decisions had not been made to build stability. They had been made to protect appearances. One memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Several years earlier, my parents had hosted a large anniversary celebration. The event was beautiful. Catered food, live music, decorations everywhere. At the time, I thought they were simply enjoying a milestone. Looking back, I remembered overhearing a quiet argument about money shortly before the event. I never paid attention then. Now it felt significant. Piece by piece, old memories were changing shape. The hardest part was not discovering the truth. The hardest part was accepting that the people involved were my parents. Every new document forced me to confront that reality again. By the end of the week, the evidence covered nearly half my dining table. I stood there late one evening, studying the growing collection. For months I had searched for answers. Now the answers were beginning to appear. And what frightened me most was the realization that this story was far from over. The documents were not revealing a single mistake. They were revealing years of secrets. About 2 weeks before the event at the country club, something changed. Until then, my parents had behaved cautiously, almost as if they feared being questioned. Suddenly, they became confident. The shift was subtle at first. My mother began mentioning the upcoming gathering during nearly every conversation. My father repeatedly emphasized how important it was that the entire family attend. Friends, relatives, neighbors, business contacts. Everyone seemed to be receiving invitations. The more they talked about it, the more I sensed there was a purpose beyond celebration. One Sunday afternoon, I sat across from them at their dining room table while my mother described seating arrangements and menu options. She spoke enthusiastically about centerpieces and guest lists, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. My father remained unusually quiet, occasionally glancing toward her before returning his attention to his coffee. It felt less like planning a family event and more like preparing for a performance. As the date approached, other strange things happened. A cousin called to ask whether everything was all right between me and my parents. The question caught me off guard. When I asked why, she hesitated before admitting she had heard vague comments suggesting there had been tension within the family. Nothing specific, just enough to create curiosity. A few days later, an old family friend made a similar remark. Then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Someone was planting a narrative. Not openly, not directly, just enough to influence opinions before anyone knew the full story. I did not respond. I did not defend myself. Every instinct urged me to correct the rumors, but Rachel convinced me otherwise. One evening she sat at my apartment reviewing documents while I paced the living room. "They want a reaction," she said. "If you start arguing now, people will focus on the argument instead of the facts." Deep down, I knew she was right. Still, remaining silent felt unbearable. The evidence continued growing. More records arrived. More connections emerged. By then, we had organized everything into chronological order. The timeline stretched across years. Every document supported the same conclusion. Yet despite everything I knew, I still struggled with one painful reality. These were my parents. The people who taught me to ride a bicycle. The people who attended my school events. The people whose approval I spent years trying to earn. Accepting the truth felt like grieving someone who was still alive. 3 nights before the gathering, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded warm, almost cheerful. She said she hoped I would attend and reminded me how much family meant. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but something about it unsettled me. There was a rehearsed quality to every sentence, as though she already knew how the evening would unfold. After hanging up, I sat quietly at my kitchen table staring at my phone. Then I looked toward the growing stack of evidence secured inside my desk drawer. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Publicly, my parents were presenting themselves as loving and disappointed. Privately, the documents told a completely different story. The night before the event, I barely slept. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the city lights glowed beyond the glass. Around midnight, I opened the drawer and reviewed every document one final time. When I finished, I placed the most important records into a manila envelope and slipped it into my handbag. For months I had been searching for answers. Now I understood something else. My parents believed they controlled the story. They believed the audience would accept whatever version of events they presented. What they did not realize was that I was no longer walking into that room unprepared. The applause that followed my father's speech sounded polite at first, then gradually spread through the ballroom as guests attempted to ease the tension hanging in the air. My parents smiled graciously, accepting sympathetic looks and quiet nods from people who believed they had just witnessed 2 heartbroken parents speaking honestly about a difficult daughter. I remained seated for several seconds, watching the room carefully. This was the moment they had planned. They had spent weeks shaping perceptions before anyone ever entered the country club. They had prepared the audience long before they stepped onto the stage. What they had not prepared for was the truth. I stood slowly and reached for my handbag. Several nearby guests glanced toward me. My mother noticed the movement immediately. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed her face before the smile returned. I walked toward the front of the room at a steady pace. The sound of my heels against the hardwood floor seemed unusually loud. Conversations faded. People began turning in their chairs. My father watched me approach with an expression that appeared calm, but I noticed his jaw tighten slightly. When I reached the stage, I stopped beside them. The room fell silent again. "I only want to say a few things," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. No anger, no shouting, just calm. For months, I tried to understand why certain things in my life stopped making sense. A few guests exchanged curious looks. My mother folded her hands together. "I did not come here to argue," I continued, "and I am not interested in embarrassing anyone. I only want facts to speak for themselves." Then I removed the manila envelope from my handbag. The reaction was immediate. My father's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. A slight loss of color. A brief hesitation. The first visible crack in the confidence he had displayed all evening. I opened the envelope and removed several copies of documents. A few months ago, I discovered financial accounts under my name that I never authorized. The room remained completely silent. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake. Then I started gathering records. I held up several pages. Applications, account histories, correspondence records, dates. No one interrupted. No one moved. Even the servers carrying trays of food seemed frozen in place. I continued carefully. Every sentence was deliberate. Every statement supported by evidence. I explained how the accounts had been opened, how personal information had been used, how records connected the activity to email addresses and details that could not be explained away as coincidence. I never accused. I never attacked. I simply presented facts. The difference mattered. People can argue with emotions. They struggle to argue with documents. As I spoke, expressions around the room began to change. Confusion replaced sympathy. Questions replaced certainty. Several guests quietly reviewed copies I handed to them. Others stared toward my parents, waiting for an explanation. My mother attempted to speak once, but stopped before forming a complete sentence. My father looked down at the floor. For the first time that evening, neither of them appeared in control. The narrative they had carefully constructed was unraveling in real time. I glanced across the room and saw Rachel standing near the back. She gave a small nod. Nothing more. She understood what was happening. The truth was finally reaching people without distortion, without manipulation, without performance. I looked back at the crowd and placed the final document on the table beside me. The ballroom remained so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. No one seemed interested in dinner anymore. No one cared about the decorations or speeches. The room wanted answers. And for the first time all evening, those answers were no longer coming from my parents. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Guests sat frozen in their chairs, processing everything they had just heard. The same people who had looked at me with pity less than an hour earlier were now staring at the documents spread across the front table. Some quietly compared pages. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The atmosphere in the ballroom had completely changed. My parents stood only a few feet away, yet they suddenly seemed isolated from everyone around them. My father finally cleared his throat and stepped toward the microphone. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. He attempted to explain that there had been misunderstandings. He spoke about family difficulties and complicated circumstances. But the problem with explanations is that they arrive too late when evidence has already spoken first. Every sentence felt weaker than the documents lying in plain view. My mother tried next. Her voice trembled slightly as she talked about sacrifices, good intentions, and mistakes. Some guests listened politely. Others looked away. No one interrupted her. No one rushed to defend her. The room had reached a point where people were no longer searching for emotional appeals. They were trying to reconcile the image they had believed for years with the reality now sitting in front of them. I stood quietly and said nothing further. There was nothing left to add. For months, I had carried the weight of confusion, suspicion, and disappointment. Now the facts belonged to everyone in the room. The burden was no longer mine alone. One by one, conversations began breaking out among the guests. A few people approached me privately. Some offered support. Others simply apologized for assumptions they had made earlier in the evening. I appreciated their kindness, but I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. For weeks I had imagined this moment. I thought exposing the truth would feel satisfying. Instead, it felt sad. The documents had proven what happened, but they could not restore what had been lost. Trust does not return simply because the truth becomes public. Rachel eventually walked over and stood beside me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We watched as guests quietly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The celebration my parents had planned was over. Not because I ruined it, because the foundation beneath it could no longer support the story they wanted people to believe. Across the room, I saw my mother sitting alone at one of the tables. For the first time all evening, she looked tired. Older somehow. My father stood nearby speaking softly with a relative. The sight stirred complicated emotions. Anger had carried me through the investigation. Determination had carried me through the confrontation. But standing there now, I mostly felt acceptance. The truth had not changed who they were. It had simply revealed who they had been all along. A little later, I picked up my handbag and walked toward the exit. The ballroom lights reflected off polished floors as guests continued filing out into the night. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. Outside, the evening air felt cool and clean. The parking lot stretched beneath rows of tall lamps. In the distance, traffic moved steadily along the highway. Ordinary sounds, ordinary lights. The world continued exactly as it had before. I stood there for a moment looking up at the dark sky. Then I took a slow breath and smiled for the first time in months. Not because I had won, not because anyone else had lost, but because I no longer had to carry someone else's secrets. My parents spent years protecting an image. I spent months uncovering the truth. In the end, the truth required no performance, no microphone, and no carefully rehearsed speech. It only required the courage to stop protecting a lie. Then I turned toward my car and drove away, leaving the story they created behind me and finally choosing my own future.